The music stopped mid-note. One moment, the room was alive with the reckless energy of a saxophone solo and the clinking of glasses. The next, there was only silence, the kind of heavy, sudden silence that makes your heart pound in your ears. Then came the sound. Not a polite knock, but a hard, splintering impact against the door. Wood cracked. A woman's champagne glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor. The illusion of glamour, so carefully constructed over the last few hours, evaporated in an instant. This wasn't a party anymore, this was a fight for survival, and it all started with an invitation. You're picturing the roaring 20s, right? Flappers in fringe, glittering headbands, and a sense of carefree rebellion. That's the myth we've been sold. The reality was far more dangerous, and it began the moment you tried to find the party. There were no neon signs, no public listings. Finding a speakeasy required a whispered password, a knowing nod, a referral from someone who knew someone. You'd walk down a dark alley, looking for an unmarked door that could belong to a butcher shop or a warehouse. The whole process was designed to filter out the uninitiated, but it also created an immediate sense of unease. You were stepping out of the public world and into a shadow economy. When you finally got inside, the initial impression was deliberately disarming. After the tension of the approach, the interior felt like a sanctuary. Dim, amber lighting hid the imperfections in the walls. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the syncopated rhythms of a jazz band playing in the corner. People were laughing, dancing, it looked like the movies. But if you looked closer, past the veneer of excitement, you'd see the first red flags. The clientele was an uneasy mix. There were the socialites in their pearls, slumming it for a thrill, rubbing shoulders with hardened figures who clearly operated outside the law. The bartender didn't just pour drinks, he kept one eye on the door, his movements quick and efficient. Your modern brain, conditioned by safe, regulated nightlife, would try to dismiss this discomfort. You'd tell yourself this was part of the authentic experience, the gritty reality behind the glamour. That decision to stay, to ignore that primal warning signal, was the first critical mistake. You were dismissing the very instincts that were meant to keep you alive. In a 1920s speakeasy, the rules of civilized society were suspended. The only law was the law of the room, and you were about to learn it the hard way, starting with what was in your glass. You'd approach the bar, feeling a bit more confident now that you'd made it inside. You'd order a gin, something simple. The bartender would nod, turn, and pour from an unlabeled bottle with a speed that was suspicious. There was no careful measuring, no premium brand to admire. The liquid he slid across the bar was clear, but that's where the similarity to any modern spirit ended. You'd take that first sip, expecting the familiar botanical bite of gin. What you'd get was a chemical burn that scraped the back of your throat. It tasted harsh, industrial, with a sickly sweet undertone that clung to your tongue. This wasn't a drink, it was a concoction. While you were trying not to cough, you'd overhear the whispers circulating among the more seasoned patrons. Words like jackass brandy and smoke. These weren't clever cocktail names, they were grim warnings. Jackass brandy was a crude mixture that could include anything from industrial alcohol to toxic additives to give it a kick. Smoke referred to a particularly dangerous type of moonshine, nicknamed for the blinding headaches it caused. The alcohol supply was completely unregulated, brewed in hidden basements with no concern for safety. Profit was the only motive, and cutting corners with poisonous ingredients was standard practice. The real horror would dawn on you slowly, perhaps when you saw another patron a few feet away suddenly clutch his stomach, his face turning a pale shade of green before he stumbled toward a back room. That wasn't just someone who had too much to drink, that was someone being poisoned. Throughout the Prohibition era, The US government recorded over 10,000 deaths from alcohol poisoning, with many more suffering permanent blindness or organ damage. The government's poisoning program, officially called denaturing, added chemicals like methanol, kerosene, and even chloroform to industrial alcohol. Bootleggers' attempts to redistill these toxic mixtures often failed. In 1928 alone, New York City reported 41 deaths from a single batch of contaminated whiskey. You were literally gambling with your life with every sip. This presented you with an impossible choice. Do you continue to drink, risking neurological damage, blindness, or worse, to maintain your cover and not draw attention? Or do you refuse the drink, potentially marking yourself as a suspicious outsider or even worse, a potential informant? In a room where trust was non-existent, not participating in the central ritual of drinking could be just as dangerous as the poison itself. There was no safe option, only varying degrees of risk. The glass in your hand wasn't a symbol of celebration, it was a weapon, and you had to decide whether to turn it on yourself or risk the wrath of the people who served it. So you've managed to navigate the first immediate physical danger, the poison in your glass. But now you have to navigate the people, and that was arguably the more complex threat. A speakeasy wasn't a public bar where anyone could mind their own business. It was a closed ecosystem with its own strict, unspoken codes of conduct. Your modern sense of social etiquette would be your biggest liability here. Smiling at the wrong person, accidentally bumping into someone, or even making eye contact for a second too long could be interpreted as a challenge. There were no bouncers to de-escalate a situation. The only authority was often the very criminal element that ran the place, and their justice was swift and brutal. You'd notice the tension in the room wasn't just from the fear of a raid, it was a social tension, a palpable unease born from throwing together people who would never normally interact. High society debutantes, slumming it for a thrill, were sharing space with gangsters, corrupt politicians, and working-class people looking for an escape. These worlds were colliding in a pressure cooker of illicit alcohol. A misplaced word from a wealthy patron could be seen as an insult by a mob enforcer. A joke that landed wrong could escalate in seconds. The atmosphere was a volatile mix of paranoia and performative confidence. Everyone was pretending to belong, which made everyone suspicious of everyone else. The criminal element present was the most dangerous variable. This wasn't abstract danger. These were people who had already made the decision to operate outside the law. Figures connected to organized crime, enforcers, collectors, those making their way up the ranks, saw the speakeasy as their territory. A perceived slight could escalate from a sharp word to something much worse. There were no cameras, no reliable witnesses, no emergency services you could call. If you angered the wrong person, your best hope was that they'd throw you out into the alley. Your worst fear was that you wouldn't make it that far. The stories of people who disappeared after a night at a speakeasy weren't urban legends. They were covered in the crime sections of newspapers, often reported with unsettling vagueness. The police rarely investigated too deeply. After all, the victim had chosen to be in an illegal establishment. They had asked for it. This created a suffocating paradox. To survive socially, you had to act like you belonged, but acting too confident could make you a target. You had to drink to fit in, but the drink could kill you. You had to be friendly enough to avoid suspicion, but not so friendly that you accidentally formed an alliance or offended someone connected. Every interaction was a high-stakes calculation. And the most dangerous part was that the rules were invisible. They weren't posted anywhere. You learned them by watching, by reading the subtle cues in body language, the shift in conversation when a particular person entered the room. One wrong move, and your education would be over, along with possibly your life. The people around you weren't just partygoers. They were actors in a tense, improvised drama where the script could turn deadly at any moment. And you were on stage, whether you wanted to be or not. Then came the moment every speakeasy patron dreaded but knew was inevitable. The raid. The first sign would be subtle. A sudden shift in the bartender's posture, a whispered warning rippling through the crowd faster than sound. Then the door would explode inward, not with the polite knock of a neighbor, but with the violent authority of the law, wielded by men who knew they had all the power in the room. Police officers would pour in, some in uniform, some in plain clothes, shouting commands, overturning tables, smashing bottles against walls. The jazz band would stop mid-bar, the musicians freezing with their instruments half raised, as if the music itself had been arrested. The glittering illusion of the speakeasy would shatter in an instant, revealing what it always was: a trap. The terror of a raid wasn't just about arrest, it was about the sudden loss of control and the unpredictable violence that came with it. Police conducting speakeasy raids operated in a legal grey zone. The Volstead Act gave them broad powers, but there were few checks on their behaviour. Officers knew they could act with near impunity. Raids were often brutal. Tables were overturned, patrons shoved against walls. Anyone who resisted, or even moved too slowly, risked being struck with a baton. Women weren't spared the rough treatment. Accounts from the era describe female patrons being manhandled, their expensive dresses torn, their dignity stripped away in front of a crowd. The raid wasn't just law enforcement, it was a public humiliation designed to punish the act of defiance that the speakeasy represented. Your immediate instinct would be to run, but where? Speakeasies were designed with hidden entrances and exits for a reason, but in the chaos of a raid, those routes became choke points. Everyone was trying to escape at once, pushing, shoving, trampling anyone who fell. The back exit, if you could even find it in the smoke and dim light, might lead to an alley already blocked by more officers. You'd be caught between the advancing police inside and the waiting arms of the law outside. Your only option might be to try to blend in, to make yourself invisible, pressing yourself into a corner and hoping the officer's attention landed on someone else. But invisibility was a gamble. If you looked too guilty, you'd be grabbed. If you looked too calm, you'd be suspected of being a regular, someone worth interrogating for information. But invisibility was a fragile defense. The police weren't just there for the owners. They were there to make arrests, to fill quotas, to prove they were doing their job. Anyone caught in the net was a statistic. You'd press yourself against a damp wall, trying to control your breathing, watching as people were dragged past you. The risk wasn't just arrest. It was getting caught in the crossfire of a struggle, being mistakenly identified as someone important, or simply being in the wrong place when an officer decided to make an example of someone. The shattering of glass wasn't just the sound of broken bottles, it was the sound of the entire glamorous facade finally breaking into a million sharp, dangerous pieces. Any remaining belief that this was a sophisticated game of cat and mouse would vanish. This was raw, unfiltered power, and you were completely at its mercy. The final blow to the illusion came when you saw the interaction between the lead officer and the man you assumed was the owner. It wasn't a confrontation, it was a quiet, tense conversation happening in the middle of the storm. A nod, a subtle exchange of something that wasn't words. Then the officer would bark a new order, and the focus of the raid would shift, conveniently avoiding a certain part of the room or a certain group of people. In that moment, you'd understand the true mechanics of the speakeasy. It wasn't a rebellion against authority. It was a negotiation with it. The raid was just another transaction, and the people being arrested were the cost of doing business. You were either a player in that transaction, a protected asset, or you were collateral damage. And as an anonymous face in the crowd, You were almost certainly the latter. The fight for survival was no longer abstract. It was about avoiding the hand that would grab you next. Let's say you were unlucky. Let's say an officer's flashlight beam landed on your face and a strong hand clamped down on your shoulder. The immediate fear of the arrest would be nothing compared to the slow, dawning horror of what came next. Being hauled out of the speakeasy was just the beginning. The real trap was the legal and social system that awaited you. For a person of means, an arrest was a nuisance. A few phone calls, a discreet payment to the right people, and the charges might miraculously disappear. But for someone without connections or wealth, the system was designed to break you. The justice system itself was a weapon. The courts were overloaded with prohibition cases, and the process was swift and unforgiving. A conviction for violating the Volstead Act could mean a fine of up to $1,000, equivalent to nearly $15,000 today, or up to 5 years in prison. The courts processed over 300,000 prohibition cases, overwhelming the legal system. Yet the penalties fell disproportionately on small-time operators. Big-time bootleggers like Al Capone operated with near impunity for years through political connections and witness intimidation. But the formal penalty was only part of the punishment. The real consequence was the public scandal. Your name would appear in the newspaper, branding you as a criminal. You could lose your job, your reputation, your standing in the community. The stain of a prohibition arrest could follow you for life, a permanent mark of shame in an era that prized public respectability. The speakeasy offered a temporary escape, but getting caught guaranteed a long-term prison of social exile, and the extortion didn't end at the station house. Once you were in the system, you became a target for everyone. The police who arrested you might offer a deal, pay a fine directly to them, and maybe the paperwork gets lost. If you refused, you faced the full weight of the law. But if you paid, you marked yourself as someone who could be shaken down again. Meanwhile, the mob figures who ran the speakeasy had their own concerns. If they thought you might talk to avoid jail time, you became a liability. Your arrest could make you a target for intimidation or worse. You were caught between two corrupt systems, both seeing you as a source of revenue or a problem to be eliminated. There was no path that led back to your normal life unscathed. This was the sobering weight of the era's true power dynamics. The speakeasy wasn't a democratic space of rebellion. It was a microcosm of the inequalities of the 1920s. The wealthy and connected could navigate the risks, treating the danger as a thrill. For everyone else, a single night out was a gamble with consequences that could destroy them. Survival in this context meant more than just physically getting out of the building alive. It meant navigating the aftermath with your freedom, your finances, and your future intact. As you sat in a cold, holding cell, the roar of the 20s would sound very different. It wasn't the sound of jazz and liberation. It was the sound of desperation, of a society tearing itself apart over a bottle of poison gin, with the most vulnerable paying the highest price. The understanding would settle deep in your bones. In this world, there were no second chances, only varying degrees of ruin. But let's imagine a different outcome. Let's say you got lucky. In the chaos of overturned tables and shouting, a path opened, perhaps a back door, used by the staff to dispose of empty barrels, was left unguarded for a critical few seconds. You wouldn't run. You'd move with a controlled, desperate urgency, slipping through the doorway and into a pitch-black alley. The cold night air would hit you like a physical blow, a stark contrast to the sweaty, panicked atmosphere you just escaped. You wouldn't stop to look back. You'd just walk quickly, turning corners at random, putting as much distance as possible between you and that unmarked door. The immediate relief would be overwhelming, a flood of adrenaline leaving you shaking. But it would be quickly replaced by a deeper, more profound unease. Emerging into the relative safety of a main street under the glow of a street lamp, you'd be forever changed. The sounds of a normal city night, a distant trolley bell, the murmur of other pedestrians would feel alien. You'd look at the well-lit storefronts and orderly traffic with a new appreciation, but also a new suspicion. The experience would strip away the romantic myth of the Roaring Twenties completely. You'd understand that the roar wasn't just the sound of jazz and laughter. It was the sound of a society under immense pressure, a desperate clamour that often ended in silence. The glamour was a performance, a thin disguise for a world running on fear, risk, and exploitation. The people inside weren't just carefree rebels. They were desperate for an escape during an era when the suicide rate increased by 22% and mental hospital admissions soared. They were willing to gamble their health, their freedom, and their lives for a few hours of forgetfulness from the pressures of the Great Depression that began in 1929 when unemployment reached nearly 25%. The speakeasy wasn't a playground, it was a pressure cooker. By 1925, New York City had an estimated 32,000 speakeasies, double the number of legal bars that existed before Prohibition. This underground economy generated $3 billion annually, about $45 billion today, fueling both criminal empires and corrupt political machines. And you had just felt the heat. The lesson learned wasn't about a specific event, but about the entire ecosystem of prohibition. It created a shadow world where the normal rules of safety and decency didn't apply, where every pleasure came with a potentially fatal price tag. You'd walk home not with a story of a wild night, but with the sobering understanding of how fragile modern safety really is and how much we take for granted. The story of the speakeasy is ultimately less about the alcohol and more about what people were willing to endure for a taste of normalcy. When Prohibition finally ended in 1933, the government had spent over $300 million enforcing it while losing $11 billion in tax revenue, all for a policy that increased drinking rates by over 20% and created the modern American organized crime syndicate. The real untold story is the human cost hidden behind the sequins and the saxophone solos. It was a world of genuine danger, where survival depended on luck and silence. That echo of the roar is a reminder of how thin the line can be between order and chaos. Behind the jazz and champagne, the 1920s are hiding many more dark secrets. If you want to know the real stories, make sure to subscribe to the Untold 20s.